Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to another episode of the Critical Corner. Actually, the third episode of this recurring series that I am doing on my channel. The Critical Corner is a series where I review a lot of things that I've missed or I just can't dedicate a full review to. I either dedicate these series to all music or all movies. Today's episode of the Critical Corner is focused entirely on movies, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our first film.
And soon enough, I was back on my feet, ready to embrace the fierce goddess within.
Okay, our first film is Birds of Prey. I'm not really the hugest fan of DC films. I don't think most of them have been that great. In fact, the one that I've enjoyed the most has probably been Wonder Woman, and even at that, I don't think that movie is quite as good as what Marvel has produced. I know it's somewhat unfair to compare the two companies, but DC has always seemed to be riding on the tailcoats of Marvel every step of the way, and they just haven't really been able to make a truly great movie since the Dark Knight series. And thankfully, Birds of Prey turned out to be a pretty enjoyable movie. This one revolves entirely around Harley Quinn, and basically she's being hunted down by this villain named Roman, played by Ewan McGregor, who wants her to get this jewel for him. But it ends up that she recruits a bunch of other people on her side, and they basically try to take down this villain and basically overcome him. I think this film is really fun as a whole. It's not perfect, but I did enjoy myself while watching this film. I think that's partly due to how much fun Margot Robbie is having with her performance. She really embodies the character of Harley Quinn really well in this movie. I think we get to see a much more interesting look into her personality with how the narrative plays out in this sort of confusing and haphazard manner, which I think was purposeful because Harley Quinn clearly doesn't think the most conventionally, at least, and I like that the movie represents that through how it tells its story. And actually, Ewan McGregor was really fun here too as the villain. I appreciated how over-the-top he played his character, and he just provided a really good menacing counterpart to Harley Quinn. Also, all the other women that were alongside Margot Robbie in this movie, all the other Birds of Prey that were Harley Quinn's partners, I thought they were pretty interesting too. Especially the kid character. I think that she was probably the most complex out of anyone here. I think probably my biggest critique of this movie is that sometimes the haphazard way it plays out plot-wise can be a little confusing. And also, I think the trailers for this movie were a little misleading. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I think the movie was trying to promote itself as being more of this team movie where every character in the Birds of Prey would be getting equal screen time. It's not necessarily the case here. It more focuses on Harley Quinn, and the Birds of Prey characters really don't get any sort of character development besides Child until the climax of the movie, which really makes it hard to entirely root for them. Some of the narration from Harley Quinn herself wasn't really needed. Like all this exposition narrative, I think it took away from the interest of the story a little bit too much at times. Birds of Prey was a pretty fun movie and is one of DC's better films, so I'm going to give it a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars.
Who's in the shadows?
Next up is the film The Hunt. For some reason, this movie got a lot of controversy attached around it. I suppose it was hated by both political parties for the fact that the film was either looked at as conservatives by portraying them as real idiots or something like that, and hated by liberals for portraying them as killers. I don't think the controversy of this movie was really that big of a deal. And the main reason for that is that the movie is just really underwhelming more than anything. I don't really think it works, even though I thought the premise was actually pretty interesting. All these conservatives put onto a field, and all they have are some weapons, and rich liberals are basically hunting after them and trying to kill them. I think there were some interesting ideas here, perhaps talking about how easy it is for us to stereotype one side or the other, but the film doesn't really explore this that much, and the satire feels really surface level more often than not. I don't think either political side characters are interesting. I think the main villain of the liberal side is pretty underwhelming, and most of the conservative characters barely get any character development at all. The only character I did enjoy here was Betty Gilpin's character, whose name is Crystal. I think seems to be a large critic consensus, is that Crystal is the most interesting character here because she doesn't seem to fit necessarily into either political party, and she seems to just have the only real relatable motivation of any character, which is just to get out of this alive. She doesn't really care about the politics. She doesn't care about the motivation of what the liberals are trying to do or what the conservatives want to do. All she wants is to get out of this place alive and survive. Plus, the film, it doesn't really keep on its premise for its whole time. Only the first parts of the movie are focused on the conservatives running from the liberals in this fielded area. I think the film actually becomes sort of dull in its final moments up until the climax, which is admittedly pretty entertaining and probably the best part of the film. Otherwise, the hunt is pretty mediocre, not really memorable, and didn't deserve the hate it got because ultimately this movie wasn't really saying much of anything as much as it thought it was. Overall, I'll give it a light 2.5 out of 5 stars. I'm definitely not coming back to this one anytime soon.
He'd been spoiled.
Out! Come on, Buck.
And he'd suffered.
Come on.
Next up is Call of the Wild. I honestly only wanted to see this movie because Harrison Ford was in it. That was really the only thing that interested me about this movie, because almost everything else made me turn off to it. I do like the novel Call of the Wild. I think it's a pretty well-written novel. The main problem with this film is, well, there's two problems with it. First of all, the film can be really dull. I think the first half hour or so of this movie could almost be shortened by at least 15 minutes. I understand why those first 15 minutes were there, but ultimately the plot doesn't really pick up until Ford's character shows up in the film. And yes, Ford's character shows up much later in the film than I expected. Now the dog, they make some interesting choices with the dog, I'll say that much. First of all, the dog being CGI, as well as all the other animals being CGI, I don't know if I really like that choice. I think they should have gone a lot more mystical with the dog part if they really wanted to go that route, or they should have just gone way more grounded if they wanted to go that route. Instead, they try to equalize the two, and ultimately, it just doesn't work. I liked the grounded parts a little bit better. The main problem with the grounded parts is that they could feel dull. And the mystical parts, the parts where the dog is like discovering his, call to the wild, I think those parts are all right. It's always messed up by the fact that the dog is CGI and it has some emotions that look way too human. Now, I'm not saying dogs can't have emotions, because they most certainly can, but some of the emotions this dog has they're unnatural and a little bit uncanny. I think Harrison Ford really lifted this movie more than anything. He's basically playing himself in this movie, which, is not something I mind. It's not like he's really playing a different character to me. I just see Harrison Ford. But I did still find him very sympathetic in the film, and I liked watching him whenever he was on screen. I'm not going to be returning to this movie anytime soon, and I think it's insane they put over $100 million into this movie when ultimately it was never going to earn that much. Pretty forgettable film. I think it could have been better if they had lessened on the CGI dog effects and maybe taken out some of the real fluff that this movie had. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me.
Obvio. Comer. ¿Qué vamos a comer? Lo que le sobra a los de arriba.
Alright, next up is The Platform. This is just yet another film where I feel like it had potential, but it didn't really deliver on it. Now, this is a Netflix original, and it's a foreign film. It's a Spanish film, I believe. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But The Platform is a dystopian film where this character wakes up to this place that he's in, this very walled-in square area, and it's one of many floors. And basically, each floor, the higher you go, basically, the better luck you have at getting some good food. It's a clear commentary to me on the greed of society and how upper class is just generally more lucky. Just because of the circumstances they've been put in, they get more lucky, they get more privileged stuff, such as getting to eat the food first. I think the satire is a little obvious, but obvious sometimes can be okay, and I think the satire of this film did work better than The Hunt did, because they were at least taking their concept a little more seriously and not putting it too over the top, at least for the beginning parts of this movie. I think the best parts of this movie are when the two main characters are interacting with each other, and just their conversations are pretty compelling. I liked those parts of the movie. Unfortunately, those parts do not last for as long as I would have hoped. And the movie really delves into almost a torture porn fest by the end of the movie, just so much gore and guts, and that's not really my thing. This movie is pretty underwhelming in its ending. I think the ending was not super interesting and left things on almost too ambiguous of a note. I sort of get what they were going for with the ending, but it was pretty underwhelming, and there were a couple things that made you wonder what exactly they were trying to say there. Overall, unfortunately, this movie once again had a great premise, a great idea, but it couldn't really execute it to the most interesting of extents. Strong 2.5 out of 5 stars, a recommendation if the concept sounds interesting to you, but I can't promise you that you're going to get a whole lot out of it, unfortunately.
You're the first who we've successfully managed to bring back, but improved, enhanced. With the technology in your veins, you have an army inside you.
This next film, I am really dreading talking about. Bloodshot. I honestly wasn't that interested in seeing this movie, but I made it a goal this year to try and pursue other genres that I'm not a huge fan of and try to see more movies this year than I had last year. Bloodshot is one of the worst movies I've seen this year. There are so many things that just don't work about it. The most primary is Vin Diesel just is not that compelling in this movie as a main character. There's some parts where he should be showing a lot of emotion here, but instead he really plays it so straight-faced and so serious that it's hard to really tap into any emotion or get any sympathy out of this character. You don't really find yourself caring for him, at least I didn't, because his character shows barely any emotion, and when there is a semblance of emotion there, it feels really half-hearted and pretty fake. There's a particularly annoying antagonist whose only quirk seems to be that he chews gum over and over again, just constant, non-stop, and it got annoying really quick. And this seemed like more of a bad director's choice than an actor's choice. Like, if you think your character becomes automatically interesting because they have this quirk, I think that just shows some bad writing choices and bad directing choices, because this character is pretty underwhelming as a villain otherwise. Vin Diesel's character has a pretty cool superpower, and there's this other girl who has this breathing apparatus that she's able to use in pretty cool ways, but they don't really do much with the concepts here. They don't do much beyond just presenting them and saying, oh, you should think this is cool, but then they don't do anything with it, so it doesn't really look that cool at the end of the day, unfortunately. Plot-wise, I feel like this movie has a lot of holes in it. After you watch the first half, and then the second half reveals this twist, which is admittedly an intriguing twist, and probably the first part of this movie that made me lean forward in my seat and actually want to know what was happening. After that twist, when you start thinking about the beginning parts of the plot, some things don't necessarily hold up. As a whole, Bloodshot is pretty underwhelming. Not a very interesting action movie, and feels more like a superhero movie from back when films like Green Lantern and Fantastic Four were coming out. Not really belonging in the era of more fun superhero movies that we have now. 2 out of 5 stars. No recommendation at all for me, really.
It was a wizard!
What? Your dad was an accountant.
This spell brings him back. For one whole day, Dad will be back!
What? Back to life? That's not...
Thankfully, we do end this episode of the Critical Corner on a positive note with Onward, Pixar's latest film. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about this film, given that the trailers didn't necessarily give me, like, the idea that I was going to love this film the same way I've loved other Pixar films like Toy Story or Inside Out. And actually, that is the reaction I had to this film. I didn't love it quite as much as other Pixar movies. It's made by the director of Monsters University, actually, and my feelings about this movie are about the same as Monsters University, where I would say that this film is pretty solid, but it's not on the upper tier of Pixar movies by any means. But Onward is actually a pretty charming road trip film about two brothers who go on a trip with their father, who they bring back through magic, because we're living in a bit of a world that is similar to ours, but also different. And they use magic to bring their father to life, but the father is only a pair of legs, and they basically go on a journey with this pair of legs, trying to bring the father back in full before time runs out. There are definitely some charming parts of this movie. I think Tom Holland was really charming in this movie. I thought he did really well with his voice acting, and his character was fun to watch, and you understood what he was going through and everything like that, and you really sympathized with his journey. I also thought Chris Pratt was pretty good, although I think the main problem with him was that his voice acting was almost a little too over the top in some parts. Sometimes he got a little annoying with how over the top he was playing his character, but I also understood that choice because the character is a little bit of an over the top personality, and he is even exaggerated in the way he's animated. Also, I do think it was a little bit of an odd choice for the movie to just make the father character a pair of legs. That made the character not super easy to connect to. Once again, I understand the reason why they did this, but it does make the father character a bit harder to connect to in comparison to the rest of the movie, and that is sort of a problem when the main premise of the movie is that they're trying to reconnect to their father. Animation-wise, this film is actually really well animated. It looks really beautiful, and I like how the characters look. I like the mystical aspects of the movie. The jokes in this movie can hit sometimes. Other times they're not as funny as in other Pixar movies, but there are some good jokes here, especially revolving around like fairy tales and stuff like that. There are several Lord of the Rings jokes in here that are actually really good and really funny. And overall, this was a pretty sweet Pixar movie. There's not really much to say about it. Themes of love and loss are pretty powerful, especially in the ending moments. There's this ending moment of the film that has a bit of a switch up that I thought was legitimately great and made me look at the movie a little more differently after watching it. But overall, this is not one of Pixar's best, but it is still really charming and I did really enjoy it. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. So that ends episode 3. What were your thoughts on any of the movies that I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to like this video and to subscribe to my channel for future content. I thank you all so much for watching this, and I hope you'll join me as I do future reviews. Until then, I will see you all in the next video.